SD card, and we can compare it to that documentation.
How closely were you trying to match the Exemplar vehicle to the defendant's vehicle?
Obviously, as closely as we could get. If I recall correctly, this is almost a perfect match to the subject vehicle.
If we could turn to page 20, please. Can you tell us what this shows? And Ms. Gilman, if you could you focus in on the top gray and white line part, if you could? A little further out, if you could. We'd like to see all three rows if possible. And if not, we'll do it from a further view. Okay. Could you share with us what this slide represents, Mr.
Sure.
Burgess?
So this slide represents a comparison between the Exemplar data and the data from the subject Lexus. In this comparison, we're looking at navigation system software. So that's going to be the infotainment system software. There's a number of different softwares running on this infotainment system for various functions. So you can see here there's a firmware version for the Wi-Fi functionality as well as the OS version, the audio, the DVD function, and I believe there's a section for the CD or disc version. So what we're looking at is we're looking at the software versions that are running on the Exemplar. We're comparing that to the software versions that are running on the subject, and those match. So we would expect to see the user data to be stored in the same way.
Is it common that an Exemplar vehicle will match the Focus vehicle exactly like this? Yeah,
so, I wouldn't say it's common or uncommon. I have seen it in the past. A lot of times with your newer vehicles, you'll probably notice some of them tend to update more often than others. For this one, it looks like the Lexus doesn't update quite as often. So we are able to see that the software versions are the same.
If we could take that down, please. And if you could remind us before we go into your findings in that SD card that was left behind. What was the most important thing you were looking for as far as data on that SD card?
Sure. So the most important thing we're looking for is time-stamped data specifically related to power on or ignition on events.
If you were to find time-stamped data for power on, power off ignition events, how would you use that? What would you use that in unison or comparison with the information that you already had?
Sure. So we would use that in comparison with provided surveillance videos to compare and see how accurate those timestamps are and how consistent they are, specifically on the night of January or the morning of January 29th.
When you analyzed the SD card, did you get viable information?
Yes, we did.
What information did you get?
So we've got a couple different data types. We got contact lists from some of the connected devices, as well as serial numbers and phone numbers associated with the connected devices, call logs, and then power on and power off events.
Was your focus on one particular aspect of that data?
Primarily, the focus was on the power on and off events.
And did you find information regarding power and power off events that could date and time those?
Yes, we did.
If we could have number 29, please. 30. Can you share with us what you found?
Sure. So this is some screenshots from our Exemplar testing. So again, these are from those cameras that I pointed out earlier. What we see when we go back and review this camera footage is we see when I press the ignition on button, there is actually a logo that appears on the infotainment screen as it's booting up. That time that logo appears on the screen is associated with a time that we see in the raw data, and that's in the hexadecimal data that is very small, so it's kind of hard to see. But essentially what you have is you've got a date and you've got a time in UTC, and then you've got a identifier that suggests that the vehicle has been powered on. So we've got 4 of these tests that we can kind of compare back to and determine that this is the time that the infotainment system powers on and that first logo screen appears. And then through testing, we can identify that that is approximately, ignition on is approximately 3 seconds before that timestamp.
So do I understand if you press the button to start the vehicle, there's a 3-second delay before the actual vehicle starts?
Correct. So not the actual vehicle starting. So you press the ignition on button, there's a 3-second delay in when the infotainment system powers on.
Is there any way, Ms. Gilman, to focus in on one of those 2 photos? Can you tell us what this information is?
Sure. So this is those camera angles. And what you see is I'm pressing the ignition on at this time. In that second photo on the right, you'll see that this is specifically approximately 3 seconds after I press that ignition on, and you see the Lexus logo appearing on the infotainment module.
Let me ask you something about the clocks while we're here. You see a local time on there?
Yes, I do.
Is that local time measured by a particular clock system?
Sure. So that's measured by our reference equipment. So we're using what's called VBox equipment to capture these videos. So here, that local time is actually UTC time. So it's not actually local time for this area. So that could be a little that could be an error in how that's reporting. But essentially, what we're seeing is the infotainment system is powering on at that exact time of 21:48:08.
And this was for power on. Can we have number 31, please? How's this different than the one we just looked at?
Sure. So this is power off. So this is myself pressing the ignition to power off the vehicle. And what we see at this exact time when you power off and press the ignition button, the screen on the infotainment system becomes blank, and associated with that, it powers off, and you see a log within the raw data that indicates that.
You mentioned that you found power on, power off information. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So through this testing, what we were able to do is see that there are time-stamped power on and off events for when the infotainment system is recording a power on and power off. And then we validated that with the exemplar testing.
Ultimately, were you able to use that power on, power off timestamp information to identify the times of the later 2 events, the tech stream events, the 3-point turn and the backing maneuver?
Yes, in combination with other data, we were able to determine that.
Did you test the power on, power off data?
Yes, we did.
Could we have number 32, please? Can you tell us what this is?
Sure. So this is the first power on event after 12 o'clock on January 29th. That power event is happening at 12:36 up here in the top. And the vehicle is powered on and it's not powered off until 12:42:08.
Is there any power on, power off events in between those 2 times?
No, there's not.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that whether or not the first power on event for that night, January 29, 2022, was 12:36 a.m.?
Yes.
Your Honor.
I'll sustain it at this point.
Do you have an opinion as to the first power on event of that Lexus on January 29, 2022?
Same objection, Your Honor.
Sustained at this time.
When you studied the information from the data, does this slide reflect the information that you studied?
Yes, it does.
Were you able to determine from your data study the time that was registered of when that Lexus was turned on for the first time on January 29, 2022?
Yes, I was.
How were you able to do that?
Sure. So through our exemplar testing and determining that those timestamps are accurate to when the vehicle was powered on, we are able to say that this power on event is the first power on event of January 29th after 12 a.m.
And based on your study of the exemplar and the data from the SD card, did you arrive at an opinion as to the time of the first power on event of that Lexus vehicle on January 29, 2022?
Yes, I did.
Is your opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
And what is your opinion?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll see you at sidebar.
Mr. Burgess, could you explain for us how you can identify the power on event from the data that you discovered on that SD card that was left behind?
Sure. So through our exemplar testing, we can identify a power on event, which is depicting the time the logo on the infotainment system comes on, and then the time the infotainment system goes blank. So that is representing a power off event. And then we can reference that back to the ignition on, which occurs approximately 3 seconds before the power on, the infotainment power on event.
Is this a methodology that is used in your standard of practice?
Yes, it is.
And have you used this type of methodology before?
Yes, I have.
Is it a methodology that is regularly accepted in this
Ye-
type of analysis?
Yes, so this is a methodology that is regularly accepted in the digital forensics community, and it is a process of testing and then validating.
How does that process further validate the accuracy of the times that you are registering and finding?
Sure. So through that testing, we are able to validate that accuracy. And through that testing, we've got 4 tests that represent a power on event and 2 tests that represent a power off event. In addition to that, we are comparing that data to surveillance video with timestamps as well to show the consistency.
When you engage in your testing, you said there was 4 test runs or examples. Did you analyze it to see how, in fact, accurate it was?
Yes, I did.
And how accurate was it?
It was accurate to the second compared to our reference clock.
And when you actually take the data from that SD card, how do you interpret it? How do you get it from a piece of plastic with metal on it to actual numbers and data?
Sure. So the process of that, again, is we're making connection to those technological pads on the SD card, and we're pulling that raw data. Once we have that raw data, there's a few processes we have to go through to make that raw data interpretable. So those processes are what's called XOR scrambling. So when data is stored on an SD card, there are 2 components to the SD card. There is what's called the NAND component, and then there's a controller component. The controller component is where that, if you remember, that command 42 lock is located in that controller component. So what we're doing is we're bypassing that controller, we're accessing that NAND, and then we're using forensic software to determine and interpret the XOR scrambling that is put in place on that NAND so that we can take that scrambled data and be able to read it and interpret it, as well as what's called error correction code. So NAND devices are not, they're not great at keeping voltages accurate like they should, and that's just based on how the architecture and how the NAND components are manufactured. So what the manufacturers have done is they've put in place error correction code to correct any bit errors within that data. So what we've done is we've identified the error correction code and the XOR scrambling using software known as Resolute. That software, again, is hardware and software that we use to access that data and process it and interpret it. From there, we can take that data and we can review it in that hexadecimal format.
And based on that methodology and that process and that study, were you able to extract the data from the SD card and identify the first power-on event of the defendant's Lexus on January 29th, 2022 to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I was.
And do you have an opinion about what time that Lexus, the defendant's Lexus, was powered on December 29th, 2022 for the first time?
Yes, that would be approximately 12/12/36.
And is that to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
On your chalk on the screen, does the power out event, is that the same as your interpretation?
Yes, it is.
The 12/12/36 a.m. time, what time clock is that based on?
Sure, so that's based on the internal clock in the Lexus.
The clock in the Lexus, is that a universal time, or do clocks on different devices run differently?
Sure, so it's not a universal time. Clocks on different devices run differently. So if you've ever noticed that your microwave clock is not running in sync with your iPhone, the same thing is occurring here. Even though the Lexus clock is communicating back and forth with the GPS satellites and other things, the clock is still not synchronized perfectly. So you would not expect this clock to match up perfect with other devices.
When you're considering two very different or separate devices, if the time is different, what would that be called?
Sure, so that would be called what's called a clock variance.
I want to get into that later, but I want to finish what we have in front of us now.
Sure.
In addition to identifying the first power on event of January 29, 2022, of the defendant's Lexus at 12/12/36, were you able to identify the first power off event of that same Lexus for January 29, 2022?
Yes, I was, and that was at 12:42:08 approximately.
Did you use the same methodology and vetting that you did and testing that you did with the power on event?
Yes, I did.
And do you have an opinion if that time is accurate to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
So that opinion is that time is reliable to the second as far as the Lexus clock is concerned.
What is the graph on the bottom showing us?
Sure. So the graph is just a graphical representation of the same data, representing the power on event on a timeline at 12/12/36 and the power off event at approximately 12:42:08.
When you're looking at times, power on and power off events to date and time it, are you obtaining that information independent of other outside information?
Yes, I am.
Is the data simply the data, or does something affect it?
Sure. So no, the data is simply the data. So when we get the data, we can compare it to outside sources or external sources to verify that it's consistent with other sources. But the data does not depend on any outside sources.
Do you oftentimes use outside sources to vet or test the data, even though it's totally separate concept?
Yes, I do.
After this power on, power off event, when you studied the data from the SD card using the same methodology and technique, did you find any other subsequent power on and power off events for the defendant's Lexus on January 29, 2022 after this event?
Yes, I did.
Could we have slide 33, please? Mr. Burgess, can you tell us what the next event is that you found in the data?
Sure. So the next power on event occurs at 5:07:46. That's this top timestamp here. The infotainment system records a power off event after that at 5:46:20. And what we have here is we've got surveillance video that was provided that depicts the approximate time range that those two events happen. So these videos do not capture the actual power on or power off event, but they occur around the same time frame and they are consistent with one another.
The power on event time that you've listed as 5:07:46, where does that time come from?
So that time is coming from the internal Lexus clock.
And based on the data from the Lexus clock, do you have an opinion as to the accuracy of that time of 5:07:46 a.m. as it relates to the Lexus clock?
Yes, I do.
And what's your opinion?
So compared to the Lexus clock, that time is accurate to the second.
The videos you have, are those timed from the same Lexus clock or a different source?
No, so those timestamps of the videos are coming from external sources. In the example of these videos, I believe that is a Ring camera.
Why would you try to vet the time stamp that you've identified to the second from the Lexus clock with another item, including a video that uses a different clock?
Sure. So that further validates that those timestamps are accurate and they're consistent with timestamps we're seeing from other devices.
Can there be a variance with other devices?
There can be a variance.
If there's a variance, could that still corroborate or support the original timestamp from the Lexus clock?
Yes. So even with a variance, those timestamps can still be consistent with one another.
And on the two photographs, are those videos or photographs?
Those are videos.
What is the purpose of including a video?
Sure. So the purpose of including the video is just to depict that the video does not actually capture the power on or power off event. But again, it is around the same time frame that the power on and power off event occur.
Ms. Gilman, are you able to play the video to the left? Thank you. What about that video vets or corroborates the 5:07:46 Lexus time on the power on event?
Objection, Your Honor.
A little bit more before you get to that, Mr. Bruno.
Okay. Did you use the video that we just saw in an attempt to vet or corroborate the timestamp for the power on event on the Lexus?
Yes, I did.
How did you do that?
Sure. So looking at the start timestamp on the video, we can see that the video starts at approximately 5:07:58. Keeping in mind this timestamp is coming from the camera or the Ring video, the Ring camera itself. And when we look at the power on event, we see that it occurs at 5:07:46. So although we don't see the actual time of the power on event, that is consistent with what we would expect.
What does the video on the right help us do?
So video on the right helps us do the same thing. So when we look at the power off event, that occurs at 5:46:20. Again, when we look at the Ring video on the right, that start timestamp of that video is 5:46:29. So again, we missed the power off portion of when that occurs, but that is consistent, again, with what we would expect.
Could we play the video on the right? If you can enlarge, that would be helpful. If not, if you could stop the video, please. Mr. Burgess, you see the lights are on that vehicle?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Can you tell if the vehicle's on or off at that point?
Sure. So I cannot tell if the vehicle is on or off at that point. Typically, when you power off a Lexus or a modern vehicle, the lights will stay on for some portion of time afterwards. But again, that is consistent with the timestamp from the power off event.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy of the power on and power off events as they pertain to the Lexus clock?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
And that is that those timestamps are accurate to the second.
Did you further follow the data to see if there was any other power on, power off events relative to the Lexus for January 29, 2022?
Yes, I did.
Could you take us to Exhibit 34, please? What is this, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is the next time that the vehicle is powered on and subsequently powered off. That power on event occurs at 12:35:01. The power off event occurs at 2:12:01. And then this video is a video from alarm.com surveillance that depicts the vehicle pulling into a driveway and shutting off. So when we look at the video and we watch the video, you can actually see at 2:12:01 in the video timestamp that the windshield wipers stop moving and the vehicle's suspension begins to lower, indicating that the ignition button has been pressed.
Let's start with the power on event. Was there any video available to show the power on event at 12:35:01?
There is no video available that I'm aware of.
On the last slide, you had the power off event at 5:46:20 a.m.
Correct.
Was there any other power on, power off events between 5:46:20 a.m. and this event here?
No, there was not.
Did you try to obtain any collateral or corroborative video or evidence relative to the power on event of 12:35:01?
I did request or make a request to see if there was any video available, and as far as I'm aware, there was not.
Regarding the power on event, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy of the power on event as it relates to the Lexus clock on the system?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
That is that power on event is accurate to the second in reference to the Lexus clock.
12:35:01 p.m.?
Correct.
And do you have an opinion as to the power off event to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy from the data you recovered from the SD card?
Yes, I do. And that power off event, again, occurred at approximately 2:12:01, according to the Lexus clock.
I don't know if you can enlarge the video, Ms. Gilman, but if you can, and if not, could you play anyways? Thank you. And could you explain for us the graph on the bottom of that exhibit? Or,
Sure.
pardon me, of that diagram?
Sure. So that graph, again, is just a timeline graphical representation of when that power off event occurred, and when the power on event occurred, and when the power off event occurred at 12:35:01 and 2:12:01.
Based on the data you analyzed from the SD card, was there any further power on and power off events on January 29, 2022 after this 12:35:01 to 2:12:01 event?
Yes, there was.
Could you display for us page 35, Ms. Gilman? And what is this, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is the next power on event that is recorded within the system. And that power on event occurs approximately 4:11:46, and the power off event occurs at 4:12:56. The video we see is that same alarm.com surveillance video. The start timestamp of that video is 4:12:03. So again, we don't see the actual power on and off event within the video, but it is consistent with what we would expect as the power on event occurring at 4:11:46, and then the video starting, and we see the car backing up at 4:12:03.
Would the alarm.com be using a different clock than that of the Lexus?
It would be, yes.
And based on your methodology in vetting and testing in view of the data on the SD card, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the time of this power on event?
Yes, so
And
that
which-
power on event would be 4:11:46.
And do you have an opinion as to the time of the power off event related to this diagram?
Yes, that would be 4:12:56.
Is that opinion as well to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, it is.
Is that a photograph or a video?
That is also a video.
Ms. Gilman, could you help us? Thank you. And similarly, does the graph give a general idea of the time?
Yes, so similarly, the graph is a timeline representation of the power on and power off event.
Mr. Burgess, was there an additional power on, power off event after the power off event at 4:12:56 p.m. at the Dighton residence?
Yes, there was.
Ms. Gilman, could you show us number 36, please? Mr. Burgess, could you take us through this one?
Sure. So this is the next power off or power on event that occurs, and that power on event occurs at 5:34:51 p.m. The power off event occurs at 5:36:42. Again, the video that is associated with this does not show the power on or the power off event, but it shows the time just before the vehicle is arriving to this location on a tow truck, and that would be consistent with the vehicle then being powered off and backed off of the tow truck at that time.
And based on your analysis of the data, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty what time this power on event took place?
Yes, and that time would be 5:34:51.
And that's according to the internal Lexus clock?
Yes, it is.
Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty when this vehicle was then powered off?
Yes, and that would be 5:36:42.
Again, pursuant to the Lexus clock.
Correct.
After this event at 5:34:51 p.m. to 5:36:42 p.m., when you studied the data, were there any other power on or power off events for this Lexus vehicle on January 29, 2022?
Not that I studied after this event.
Could you take that down, please? Now, we touched on an issue earlier. I want you to give your opinions and explain to the jury. You mentioned the word variance between different items. I don't think you used the word items. You said something else.
Sure. So that's going to be the clock variance between different devices. So in this instance, what we're referring to is the difference in the clocks of the Lexus module and an iPhone. So we would not expect those clocks to be perfectly synced. Typically what we see, and is what is generally accepted, is a clock variance of up to 60 seconds. And that is because when you think about when you're looking at your radio and you're looking at the clock, it's representing to you the hours and the minutes. It's not representing the seconds. So again, it's accurate. Its function is to be accurate to the minute, but its function is not to be accurate to the second.
Is a variance between different devices an accepted concept in your community?
Yes, it is an accepted concept in my community.
When you were looking for power on, power off information from the data on the SD card, what clock would that information, that time, be dependent on?
Sure. So that's going to be dependent on the Lexus clock. That Lexus clock is continuously running, but it also syncs up with GPS systems to update the clock on occasion. We do not know how frequent that activity occurs because that is proprietary to the manufacturer themselves.
To bring us back, when you started this case, there were two important text stream events.
Correct. There were two text stream events.
Remind us what those were.
Sure. So one is going to be associated with a three-point turn, and the other is going to be associated with a backing maneuver.
In those two text stream events, are they related in any way to the running clock that is on the text stream data?
Sure. So when we think back, the text stream events have that running clock from ignition on, and because we know the power on events from the infotainment module, we can reconcile when those time counts occurred.
If there's information about timing from text stream data on the Lexus, what would you have to do if you took a separate device like an iPhone and you wanted to reconcile the variance?
Sure. So if we want to reconcile the variance, what we would need is we would need an event that occurs that both clocks record. So for instance, if you've got two cameras that are recording you jumping up and down, you would take your motion of jumping up and down or your event of jumping up and down, and you would use that event to sync the clocks of those two cameras. So essentially, we're doing the same thing with the Lexus clock and the iPhone clock.
When you did your analysis during this case, initially, did you have any interest in trying to reconcile those clocks?
No, I did not.
Why not?
Because that is generally accepted that the clock variance is up to 60 seconds. And while reviewing the power on and off events and comparing that to the surveillance videos that were provided, that was consistent with what we would have expected.
Did something compel you to further your study and compare the Lexus clock information on those two tech stream events, the three-point turn and the backing maneuver, to a different device?
Yes, there was a claim of attempting to synchronize those two clocks that I believed was potentially misleading.
So based on reviewing that information and coming to that conclusion, did you on your own do any further study about the difference in clocks and attempt to synchronize them?
Yes, I did.
You said that you can synchronize if you have more than one device identifying a particular time. What did you mean by that?
Sure. So if we've got two devices that are recording a similar event, so let's say, for instance, a three-point turn, if that is recorded with an iPhone, with the iPhone's clock, we can compare that event to the time that that event occurs and is recorded by the Lexus.
Were you aware of any device other than the Lexus recording that three-point turn?
Yes, I was.
What were you aware of?
That would be an iPhone from Mr. O'Keefe.
Did you have data and information from Mr. O'Keefe's phone some time ago?
I did have partial location data from Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone.
Did you do something with his iPhone data as it relates to the Lexus clock on those two events, the three-point turn and the backing maneuver?
I did on the three-point turn, yes, and the backing maneuver.
Okay. Tell us what you did.
Sure. So I looked at when the three-point turn occurred within the iPhone data and the location data in reference to that clock, and then looked at the same three-point turn event as it was recorded from the tech stream and the Lexus clock.
At some point, did you have enough data to make that full analysis?
Yes, I did.
Now, as a general concept, before we get to the three-point turn in detail, I want to turn to page 39 of your PowerPoint. I'm sorry, if you could turn to page 38, please. Okay. Can you explain to us the concept of synchronizing clocks?
Sure. So this is kind of a graphical representation of how to synchronize a clock. So essentially, like I said, we're taking a event that occurs. In this instance, it's a three-point turn. We have data where that three-point turn is recorded within an iPhone, and we have data where that three-point turn is recorded within the Lexus. Those events have clocks associated with them. So in order to reconcile the difference in those clocks, we are comparing the clock times for the event from each device and moving or adjusting the clock for one compared to the other.
In addition to specializing in data and computers and cars, you also mentioned that you specialize in mobile phones?
Yes, I do.
Did you use your experience in your training and your education to analyze the iPhone data from Mr. O'Keefe's phone as it related to the information from the Lexus vehicle?
Objection, Your Honor.
Can you answer that, yes or no?
Yes.
Just answer yes.
Yes,
You did?
I did.
Okay. Did you see what type of information was being stored on Mr. O'Keefe's cell phone as far as location data?
Objection, Your Honor.
I'll allow
Yes, I did. In reference to location data, Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone is recording timestamps, GPS position, speed, and heading. So heading is going to be the direction that the iPhone is facing.
Was there any particular application that you were aware of that he was using?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, he was using the Waze app for navigation.
Could we have number 39, please? Could you tell us what this shows, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So specifically what we're looking at within the location data is a 2-minute window. So that 2-minute window we see here graphically plotted on a map. And we see, it's hard to tell, but you can see a white dot, which is the center of a radius for a GPS position. The orange circles are the horizontal accuracy for each one of those positions. And then down here you can see a black line that is coming off of each GPS position that represents the heading or the direction that the iPhone is facing.
You mentioned you had some materials from Mr. Whiffen. Did you ever see any materials from Mr. Whiffen regarding location data that was acquired through the application Waze?
Yes, I did see a report by Mr. Whiffen.
Did you rely on his report, or did you independently, on your own, test the location information?
Sure. So I independently, on my own, looked at the location data from Mr. O'Keefe's phone.
This diagram that we see with all the points on it, is this developed from your own independent view and review of Mr. O'Keefe's location data?
It is.
To the top left is a round circle. What does that indicate?
Sure. So top left. So yeah. So that's going to be again the GPS coordinate beginning for this 2-minute interval that we're looking at. The orange circle is going to be the horizontal accuracy for that GPS point.
And then bring us down and up to the left. There seems to be a bigger circle on the top.
Sure. So as we come down, believe what is Cedar Crest and go up Cedar Crest, we have a position where the course heading of the iPhone changes, the speed lowers, and we have a lot more GPS points in a centralized location. So that's why you see that overlapping circles in that location.
When you're following and analyzing Mr. O'Keefe's location information, does this in any way relate to the first of those two text stream events that you originally were focused on?
It does relate to the first text stream event, which identifies a 3-point turn.
And again, although you're not an accident reconstructionist, do you know if there's data that was captured regarding this 3-point turn as far as an event?
Yes, I'm aware of data that was captured during that 3-point turn event.
If we could turn to page 40, please. I want you to explain to us how this chart works. What does a point mean?
Sure. So when we were initially provided the location data, again, we were provided a partial view or a partial data set of that location data. And within that Excel spreadsheet that data was provided in, it was identified as GPS points. So what we've got here is we've got the partial data along with the full data set that I was provided later on. So we've got a couple columns here. So we've got point, which is GPS point from that partial initial data set that I was provided. We've got timestamps. So these timestamps are every second. With every second, there is a latitude and a longitude recorded, as well as a horizontal accuracy, a speed, and again, a course heading.
When you looked at data point 154, is there a time ascribed to that?
There is a time described to that as 12:23:58.
Before you did this more in-depth analysis, were you relying on anything beyond point 154, that one line?
No, so that was the only thing that was being relied on at that time.
Why?
Because again, we were initially provided a partial data set of the location.
And why didn't you seek earlier on to break this down with more specificity?
Again, because the generally accepted clock variance is up to 60 seconds, and that data was consistent with everything else we were seeing, so there was no need to look any further.
And what compelled you again to look further?
A claim of misinterpreting and a misleading calculation trying to adjust these clocks.
Were you given a report?
I was not given a report. I was giving a PowerPoint presentation.
I see. When you decided to delve deeper into this, was that on your own initiative or were you requested to do it?
That was on my own initiative.
Now, rather than simply relying on point 154, what does breaking it down with all of the times and numbers between the green and orange do for your analysis?
Sure. So breaking it down, we can see between the green. So the green highlighted in green is position or timestamp 12:23:59. What we see happening before that time is the speed is pretty consistent between 15 and 8 miles per hour. The speed starts to drop at that point. And if we look at the course heading, we can see that the course heading before that time is pretty consistent as well, between 339 and 348. So that is, at position or at time 12:23:59, the speed drops and the course heading changes from, approximately 360, so straight north, to 284, which is in a northwesternly direction. After that time of 12:23:59, the speed recorded is 0. The course heading is 352. And at time 12:24:07, you see the speed pick back up, and the course heading is around 179 degrees. So it's going to be in a southern direction. So based on this information, we can tell that the vehicle between 12:23:59 and 12:24:07 made a three-point turn maneuver, changing from the northern direction of heading to the southern direction.
Is this data generated from Mr. O'Keefe's phone or from the Lexus?
Sure. So this data is generated from Mr. O'Keefe's phone.
Where you initially relied on 154 as a timestamp to identify the time and location of the car at a later point, does this give you more of a benefit breaking it down?
This does give you more of a benefit breaking it down.
The zeros and the speed, what does that indicate to you as far as the data relative to the portion of the three-point turn?
Sure. So it doesn't necessarily mean the vehicle is at 0 miles per hour. Again, if you look at the horizontal accuracies, we've got anywhere between 16 and 29 feet. So that's the range in the GPS and what it's seeing. So if the car is, slightly moving or moving like you would expect during a three-point turn, you would expect to see that speed at, 0 miles per hour.
Did you develop a photograph with some detail to explain this in more of a picture format?
Yes, I did make a graphical representation of this.
If we could have 41, please. Could you break this down for us, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is, again, a zoomed-in version of the map that we showed earlier. And what we've done is we've cleaned out or just removed, for the sake of simplicity, the other points leading north to this point and the points leading south. Those are going to be those 0 mile per hour indications. So what we're looking at is the heading change and that speed change, which occurs at 12:23:59. And you can see the heading change from the black arrow leading off of the center radius of the GPS position. And then at 12:24:07, you see the heading change to a southern direction, and then the other GPS points are consistent with the vehicle moving southbound on Cedar Crest.
So the claim that you analyzed, did that actually compel you to analyze and identify a more accurate variance than you originally had?
It did.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty what the variance is between the clock on the defendant's Lexus on January 29, 2022 and Mr. O'Keefe's cell phone on January 29, 2022?
Yes, I do.
And to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, what is that variance?
Objection, Your Honor.
Sustained. Need a little more, Mr. Brennan.
Okay. After you studied timestamp 154, what did that help you do? What did you learn from that?
Sure. So after studying timestamp GPS point 154 and these further GPS positions, we're able to identify the approximate, time that the 3-point turn occurred according to Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone data. So now we've got that event of when that 3-point turn occurred. Now we can compare that to the 3-point turn from the text stream data and that running clock. Again, what we're doing is taking the power on event at 12:12:36 and adding the time count from the text stream data to come up with the time of 12:23:38 in the text stream data. So the text stream data indicates a 3-point turn ended or a trigger event, a text stream event ended at approximately 12:23:38. The iPhone indicates that a 3-point turn occurred between 12:23:59 and 12:24:07. So since we've got that shared event between the two devices, we can reconcile any type of clock variance. So adjusting the Lexus clock to the iPhone clock, we can calculate that clock variance.
Is this a methodology that is commonly used in your practice?
It is.
Is it commonly used in the scientific community which you're part of?
It is.
Are there scholarly papers about this type of methodology in comparison of synchronizing clocks?
There are.
One of the papers you wrote, did that have anything to do with synchronization of clocks?
It did not have anything to do with synchronization of clocks, but it was relative to how accurate the timestamps are of events from iPhones.
And that was one of your peer-reviewed papers?
Yes, it was.
And are there scholarly journals and studies on the synchronization of clocks?
There are, yes.
Did you use that methodology in your analysis to come to arrive at an opinion about the time variance between the defendant's Lexus and Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
The clock variance is between 21 and 29 seconds.
If we could have number 42, please. What is this, Mr. Burgess?
Sure. So this is, if we think back to the last slide, we've identified the 3-point turn event in both the data sets. So now if we want to adjust one clock to the other, we can do that. And doing that, we've identified that the variance is between 21 and 29 seconds. So we would need to adjust the Lexus clock forward by 21 to 29 seconds to synchronize it with the iPhone data. So in doing that, the end of text stream event 1162.1 goes from 12:23:38 to 12:23, between 12:23:59 and 12:24:07.
These two clocks, one on the left being the Lexus clock that reads 12:23:38 a.m., and the other clock on Mr. O'Keefe's iPhone has a different time, 12:23:59 to 12:24:07. Do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty if these two clocks pertain to an event that's happening at the same time or a different time?
Yes. So these two clocks are, we are synchronizing these clocks to an event that is happening at the same time.
This is relative to the first text stream event, the 3-point turn. You said there was a second text stream event that you were analyzing.
Correct. There is a second text stream event.
And what is that second text stream event?
That second text stream event is a backing up maneuver.
Are you familiar with the time frame on the Lexus clock relative to that second text stream event?
Yes, I am.
And what is that time frame?
So it is approximately 19 minutes from the ignition on.
And do you know what time that is on the Lexus clock,
Yes, I do.
with the court's permission?
Yes.
So that is going to be 12:31:43 is going to be the end of that text stream event.
That text stream event, by the way, when it captures data, what window of data does it capture when there's a text stream event or a triggering event?
Sure. So when the trigger occurs, it captures data 5 seconds before and 5 seconds after the trigger.
What if the event is less than 10 seconds?
So if it's less than 10 seconds, it would capture the entire event. If it's more than 10 seconds, it would only capture a partial snapshot of that event.
And so when you talk about the data for the backing event, is that the 10-second window you're speaking of?
Yes, that is that 10-second window.
Does that have anything to do with defining the length of the actual event?
No, it does not.
When you looked at the time from the Lexus clock regarding that backing event, did you do an analysis of John O'Keefe's phone considering the variance that you identified?
Yes, I did. So I applied the same variance to that second text stream event.
When you apply that variance between the Lexus clock and Mr. O'Keefe's phone, what is the, could I turn to 43, please? What is the time of that event if we're referring to Mr. O'Keefe's phone?
Sure. So the time of that event with the clock variance adjusted is 12:32:04 to between 12:32:04 and 12:32:12.
And do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty as to the accuracy of that time from Mr. O'Keefe's phone considering the variance?
Yes, I do.
And what is your opinion?
And the opinion is that the second text stream event ends between 12:32:04 and 12:32:12.
When you say text stream event, that's the 10-second window?
Correct. That's the 10-second window.
Does that necessarily include the entire event?
No, it does not.
The graph on the bottom, what does that show us? It looks a little bit overwritten.
Yeah, so that graph is a timeline representation of the text stream event ending, being adjusted with the 12:32:04 to 12:32:12 in comparison with the last lock event that is recorded by Mr. O'Keefe's phone at 12:32:09.
Your analysis relative to the data that you obtained from the SD card, is your analysis and opinions separate from the other information you looked at that corroborated or supported your analysis?
Yes, they are.
I have no further questions.